The soft headlights of the training ground swept a quiet beam of light across the darkened earth. In the thin night air, the chill rising from the ground lingered over the dry grass, creating a silence so complete it seemed to catch every sound in the back of its throat. In the middle of the field, a 4-year-old Dutch shepherd sat upright, every muscle beneath his brindled black and brown coat tense, as if waiting for something that didn't belong in a standard training session. His name was Muffin. What made Muffin remarkable wasn't his high IQ, flawless obedience, or razor-sharp reflexes in the face of danger. What made him truly trusted by anyone who had worked with him was his uncanny ability to sense what humans hadn't yet perceived, as if he could hear something in the invisible air around him, a kind of intuition, or something beyond instinct. That day's training was overseen by Sergeant Lin, a seasoned head trainer who had prepared dozens of K9’s for service. He didn't believe in the sixth sense, but he thought in Muffin. And when Muffin was brought to the field with a group of other dogs, everyone expected a standard drill: scent detection, analysis, and identification of fake explosive devices. But halfway through the session, something strange happened. An old item was brought out, a bundle wrapped in faded canvas, carrying the lingering scent of vintage military explosives. No one said exactly where it came from, only that it had been stored in a special facility and was now used for complex scent identification training. The first dog, no reaction. The second growled softly, then walked away. Then came Muffin. He approached the item, took a long, slow sniff, and suddenly sat down. Not in a standard alert posture, not with hesitation. He sat as if he had seen something that didn't belong in the routine. Then he shuddered. Just slightly. An almost unconscious tremor. Muffin's eyes didn't leave the bundle. But strangely, he didn't seem afraid. Instead, his gaze carried something that looked like memory, a kind of recognition that no human could name. He didn't howl. He didn't bark. He simply sat, still, like a dog standing guard over the soul of someone long gone. Sergeant Lin frowned, jotting into his notebook. Muffin, non-standard reaction. No barking, no agitation, no explosive alert, just sat. Note, special response, cause unknown. Recommend further observation. No one said more. But as Muffin was led off the field, his eyes turned one last time, back toward the bundle. And in that silent backward glance, there was something like sorrow, or knowing, or the meeting of two souls once separated by death. The next morning, the Oklahoma sun was already scorching the metal roof of the VA hospital parking lot as Sergeant John Mercer prepped for patrol. He bent down to retie his tactical boots, glancing at the familiar figure sitting quietly beside the patrol vehicle. Muffin. "Morning, old friend," John murmured, reaching out to stroke the back of the dog's neck. Muffin didn't respond with his usual excitement. He merely turned his head slightly, his eyes still clouded in a contemplative look. Not typical of a dog eager for duty. Maybe it was the weather. Maybe it was something from the night before. John had no idea that within a few hours, Muffin would lead him to a discovery no human could have sensed in time. And it would all begin with an old truck and something lying silently beneath the seat. John slammed the patrol car door shut. The metallic clank echoed in the air, which was already boiling under the June sun. The asphalt shimmered like a mirage from an old war movie. In the VA hospital parking lot, where a veterans memorial was planned for the weekend, rows of tiny flags fluttered in the hot wind. White name plaques leaned against trees, and test announcements rang faintly from scattered loudspeakers, giving the place a solemn but restrained air. It should have been a quiet day, but Muffin was anything but quiet. The Dutch shepherd, his coat mottled like a wildfire forest at sunset, stepped out of the patrol car with a gait that was quiet but focused. Every step was calculated, unhurried, unhesitating, but never careless. Something in the air made Muffin more tense than usual, not because of duty, but because of something unnamed, something he had already started to feel. John crouched to check the radio, keeping an eye on Muffin from the corner of his vision, the way someone does when they've spent 3 years working beside a partner they trust with their life. He tapped his earpiece, then patted the dog's flank in their usual morning ritual between 2 old teammates. "Let's go, buddy." Muffin didn't respond, of course, but his dark brown eyes fixed on a specific direction, the far corner of the parking lot, where old dusty vehicles marked with stickers like USMC, Vietnam Vet, and I Served sat silently, like full stops in a story no one was reading anymore. John didn't notice at first. He walked in the opposite direction, starting with row A as usual, part of the habitual patrol routine. Muffin followed, but there was something in his walk that made John pause. The dog glanced right 3 times, each time toward the same corner. Each time his ears perked up, then slowly folded down in unease. There were no clear signs of explosives, no scent of gunpowder, no alert behavior, no instinctive reaction, but something in that direction held Muffin's full attention. "Muffin?" John called softly. The dog stopped, looked at him, then turned his head again, this time holding the gaze, as if searching not for danger but for something lost. Like an orphan spotting a familiar face in a crowd, not sure if it was what they'd lost, but certain they couldn't look away. John squinted in that direction. Corner C of the parking lot. Quiet. A few old trucks, most unlocked, paint faded, hoods flaking. One Ford F-150 stood out, not because it was flashy, but because of its eerie stillness, as if it were trying not to be noticed, yet holding something that every instinct refused to ignore. John hesitated. A memory flickered. The note from last night. Non-standard reaction. Muffin sat, no alert, strange gaze. He didn't believe in things like intuition, but he trusted the way Muffin stayed silent. "All right," he said quietly. "Let's change course." 2 figures, a man with a sidearm and a dog walking leash-free, veered off the regular patrol path and stepped into the quiet stretch at the edge of the lot. The heat was rising fast. The air felt thick. A faint scent hovered, not quite gunpowder, but like a battlefield memory lingering in the air. Muffin moved slowly. His ears stood tall, tail low, shoulders slightly taut. Signs not of fear, but something closer to reverence. John saw it the moment Muffin stopped before the truck. He didn't approach right away. He stood a few steps back, took a deep breath, slow, deliberate. Then he began to move forward, each paw step cautious, as though approaching an invisible grave. No barking, no alarm, just the breath of a dog recognizing something beyond smell or command. John stopped behind him. Muffin sat down, still silent, his eyes locked onto the truck's passenger seat, ears gently twitching as if straining to hear a distant voice. John tightened his grip on the radio at his shoulder. His other hand rested on his weapon by instinct, not fear. Inside, there was no sense of danger, only a quiet overwhelm, like he had just stepped into something ancient, something deep, something unmistakably human. An old truck, a dog, and a memory awakening under the June sun. John slowed his pace. The sun was now high overhead, casting long shadows of him and Muffin onto the softening asphalt below. The air had thickened, as if even the light breeze carried something it was unwilling to reveal. At the VA hospital grounds, sounds faded. Footsteps of passers-by became distant, and in that moment it was just him and his dog, facing an old, faded Ford F-150 that sat still like a leftover fragment from a long-gone era. Muffin came to a full stop. He took no further steps. His ears stood stiff, pulled taut by some invisible force. His front paws leaned slightly forward, his body tensed, a textbook alert posture, visible down to every sinew. John felt his heartbeat pause. This wasn't impulsive. Muffin didn't bark, didn't growl, didn't look back for permission. He chose to sit, slowly and deliberately, right beside the front passenger side wheel. That posture John had seen before. In advanced training courses, in the field, in life and death encounters. But this time, something was different. The way Muffin sat wasn't just an alert. It was a ritual, as if part of him was standing between this world and another. "Muffin," John called softly. The dog didn't turn. John crept closer, steadying his breath. His training urged him to stay cautious, but his instinct pulled him toward quiet reverence for the dog's behavior. It wasn't fear Muffin was expressing. It was memory. The truck before them was sun-bleached, glass coated in fine dust, its taillights flaking. Under the harsh light, it almost dissolved into the background, like a past no one dared disturb. On the rear window, a faded sticker read, "U.S. Marine Corps. Once a Marine, always a Marine." John placed his hand gently on Muffin's chest, feeling the dog's heavy, deliberate breathing. Muffin sat like stone, eyes fixed on the passenger seat as if someone he once knew sat there now. Through the window, John saw familiar items belonging to someone who had served. A neatly folded American flag, triangular, perfect in its funeral form, sat centered on the dashboard. Next to it, a pair of old tactical gloves, desert-colored, worn and cracked. On the back seat, a bulky duffel bag made of heavy canvas, the kind seen in thousands of combat marches. John froze. It looked like a memorial, not made of wood and flowers, but of steel and memory. And Muffin, in some way science would never explain, was standing guard before a living grave. "Muffin," John said again, softer. The dog flicked his eyes toward him briefly, then returned them to the truck. No orders, no hesitation. His gaze said simply, "I know I need to be here." John raised his hand to his radio, his mind racing. Could residual explosives still be in the truck? Was this a legitimate alert? Or was it some long-dormant chemical trace only a dog's nose could still pick up? But none of it added up. There were no trigger smells, no wiring, no suspicious boxes. Just Muffin's eyes, and a weight in the air that wouldn't lift. It felt like someone had once sat there. It felt like something unfinished refused to close. He crouched down and whispered, "What are you smelling, old friend? Gunpowder? Chemicals? Or grief?" Muffin didn't move. Suddenly, a breeze stirred. The small flag tied to the truck's antenna fluttered gently. The sunlight refracted across the window in a curve of light, like the fleeting blink of a soul not yet departed. And just then, John heard a small sound, very faint, from Muffin's throat. Not a growl, not a bark. A soft sigh, as if he were calling to something he could never quite reach. John took a deep breath. His spine chilled even as sweat ran from his brow. He's done this before, John thought. Not Muffin, maybe, but another dog, in another place, before another soldier. And now, through this rusted truck, through the smell of aged metal, through those unwavering eyes, an old soul was returning, waiting to be recognized, waiting to be released, waiting to be loved one last time, through the gaze of a dog who never knew them but somehow understood them completely. John tightened the strap of the radio on his shoulder, the summer heat suddenly feeling several degrees hotter. But it wasn't from the sun. It came from something rising inside him, a kind of instinct honed from years on the job, after handling dozens of alerts and emergencies. But today, it wasn't caution he was feeling. It was witnessing. He moved around to the passenger side, where Muffin still sat motionless, like a living statue. The dog's dark eyes were locked on the interior, unblinking, unwavering, as if his very soul was being drawn toward something hidden in the shadow beyond the glass. John reached for the sun-worn handle and slowly opened the door. It creaked, dry, metallic, like the snap of an old rope in the wind. The interior of the faded Ford F-150 was revealed inch by inch. Nothing seemed out of place at first. The seat fabric was frayed. The dashboard was dust-covered. On top sat the folded American flag, precise and unmoved. Beside it, the old gloves, desert camouflage, cracked at the fingertips, placed perfectly parallel, like hands waiting for one last mission. John froze, eyes lingering. These items weren't placed at random. Someone had arranged them with intent, remembrance, reverence, or the simple inability to let go. He crouched lower, angling into the footwell. The flashlight on his shoulder flicked on. Its beam swept across the floor beneath the seat and stopped. Tucked just behind the front seat, nearly hidden, was a compact, carefully wrapped object, a dark silhouette against the dusty floor. Roughly the size of a hardcover book, it was wrapped in olive green canvas, the kind used in old military gear. Layers of silver duct tape were wrapped tightly around it, pressing the fabric flat, revealing creases from multiple times being folded and rewrapped. John's throat went dry. There was no official reason to suspect it was dangerous, but a different weight emanated from it. The same weight you feel walking into the room of someone who has passed. Silence, yet presence. He reached in, pulling it from the shadows with care, as though he might disturb something sacred. Muffin leaned in. He didn't lunge, didn't bark, just tilted his head slightly, ears twitching, his eyes tracking every motion, braced for something familiar to emerge. John placed the object on the truck's hood. The metal burned hot through his gloves, but the bundle was cool, unnaturally cool. A coldness of time, not temperature. Muffin stood up. His posture shifted from alert to sentinel. He stepped forward slowly, each step measured, and stopped beside the object. He lowered his head gently, tail still, gaze now hollow with something unspeakably deep. John drew a small knife from his belt, slicing through the dust-covered tape. Layer by layer, the canvas unwrapped, like peeling back a buried era. And then it appeared. A metal capsule, not long, not large, but heavy with the weight of lives lost. Its surface was rough, blackened with scorch marks. One end was dented, like it had taken a brutal impact. Fine scratches ran along the side, some of them claw-like, or fingernail marks. John lifted it with both hands. No one had to tell him what it was. He had seen these before, in reports, at recovery sites, in silent shipments from war zones. A memorial capsule. Not a weapon, not equipment, but a container for someone's fragment. It might hold a piece of bone, a wedding ring, a dog tag, even blood-soaked soil from where someone fell. Muffin stepped forward slightly. Then, ever so gently, he lowered his head and touched his nose to the metal surface, as if scenting the soul that had lingered there for a decade. John didn't breathe. In that moment, all sound vanished. The wind, the speakers, the distant footsteps. There was only a man and a dog, standing before the ashes of something lost, something neither of them could name, yet both understood completely. Muffin didn't sound the alarm. He didn't growl. He didn't follow any protocol from his training. He simply sat there, silent and still, as if facing something so familiar it hurt. And only he knew why it mattered. John slowly sat down beside him, his eyes lit beneath the sunlight. He didn't know exactly what he was holding in his hands, but he knew, as always, Muffin had never been wrong. And if Muffin sat like this, then this wasn't evidence. This was a relic. Muffin sat beside the capsule as if he had been born for this purpose alone, to stand guard over something that had remained silent for far too long. A breeze passed again, carrying the sun-scorched scent of metal and dry grass from the field. But to John, nothing was more distinct than the feeling that he was standing before something both ancient and untouched. He was about to call it in for inspection when footsteps sounded behind him, steady, slow, sure, echoing somewhere from between the sun-streaked rows of cars. John didn't turn right away. Muffin did. The dog lifted his neck slightly, ears twitching towards the sound. He didn't growl, didn't stand as he would for a stranger, but his body shifted, just enough, from stillness into a state of quiet alertness, like a soldier who just recognized a figure from a dream long past. John turned. A middle-aged man was approaching. He wore a faded gray t-shirt, neatly pressed jeans, and a pair of worn military boots. The way he moved, steady but reserved, suggested he wasn't just anyone. Broad shoulders, slightly hunched, as though bearing a weight no one else could see. And his eyes, the first thing John always studied, were thick with the haze of unresolved things, like smoke that wouldn't clear. The man stopped a few meters away. He didn't look at John first. He looked straight at the capsule resting on the hood, and then at Muffin. Something passed through his eyes. Not fear, not surprise, but recognition. He nodded once. "I suppose you found it." John didn't answer immediately. His hand stayed near his holster, eyes glancing toward Muffin, who remained in position, not defensive. Instead, he watched the man as if he had seen him before, not with his eyes, but with something buried deep in species memory. The man took one more step, but no closer. He stopped, pulling a tarnished set of keys from his pocket. "Logan Granger," he said, his voice rough, even, quiet, like gravel rolling across damp stone. "That F-150's mine." John gave a small nod, shifting slightly to stand between Muffin and the man. Natural, not threatening. "Officer John Marston, K9 unit," he said. "This is my service dog Muffin. He located the object under the passenger seat. Can you tell me what it is?" Logan didn't answer right away. His eyes stayed on Muffin, where the dog's ears stood calmly, and his nose had only minutes earlier touched the memorial capsule. Logan's face twitched, just for a second, like he had seen the ghost of someone return in a different form. He nodded slowly. "I think I should tell you." John let him speak. Every movement Logan made was deliberate, not out of fear, but as if walking back through an old memory where every step landed on something sacred left unnamed. 10 years, Logan said, still staring at Muffin. "I've carried it for 10 years, wrapped tight. Never let anyone touch it. Every time I moved houses, I carried it myself. Never the movers, and each time I added another layer of cloth." Muffin tilted his head slightly, eyes still locked on the man. A long, still gaze, like he was weighing a soul that had just crossed the threshold of a trauma ward it never dared enter before. John asked slowly, not pressing, "What's inside?" Logan let out a quiet laugh, a sound with no echo, like a breeze sweeping over battlefield ruins. "It's the one thing I couldn't leave behind." He paused. "It's what's left of Atlas." That name, Atlas, slipped from Logan's mouth like an invocation, and in that exact moment, Muffin lifted his head and looked directly into Logan's eyes. No command, no cue, just a look. But it was enough for a veteran to feel seen, not by a person, but by the soul of what he never buried. John said nothing. He simply stood there, beside his dog, sensing that today was not a task. Today was a ceremony. No music, no speech, just a dog who sat when he knew something needed peace, and a man who finally stepped into the light. Logan knelt, not because his knees hurt, and not because the summer heat radiating from the car hood wore him out. He knelt because it was time to face what he had buried deep in the darkest part of his mind for the past 10 years. In front of him lay the memorial capsule, small, silent, and heavy. Not heavy from metal, but from memory. The memory of a name he hadn't dared utter since that day. Atlas. Muffin sat right beside the capsule, neither wary nor friendly. He just sat, silent but present, as if he understood this moment didn't call for barking or movement, only witnessing. John stood nearby, saying nothing. Years in the K9 unit had taught him one thing. Sometimes, silence is the deepest form of respect, and today was one of those moments. Logan stared at the capsule for a long time, as if there were eyes inside looking back at him. His rough hand lightly touched the scorched metal shell, each finger brushing across the dents of time, as if rereading every line of memory he once tried to burn away. "You asked me what it is?" Logan said, his eyes still fixed on the object. "It's the only thing I could bring back." His voice was hoarse, as if every word had to squeeze through a rusted door. "After that mission, no one came back whole. Not people, not dogs. Some had bodies, Some didn't. Sometimes all that was left was 3 shards of armor and a little blood-soaked dirt. He swallowed hard. I picked up every bit, every grain of sand, a burned tuft of fur, a scorched button. At that moment, Muffin shifted slightly, as if he sensed the name Atlas drifting through the air, not quite reacting to the sound, but moving instinctively, like he had once heard it long ago. Logan glanced at Muffin for the first time, his eyes unguarded, only wonder there, and something like trust. I don't expect anyone to understand, he continued. Nobody in the therapy group does. Every week I show up, sit in a corner, and say nothing. Each person shares their story, and when it's my turn, I just nod and stay quiet. He let out a dry, hollow chuckle. Because how could I tell them I kept a part of a combat dog that died 10 years ago? How do you explain to someone that you didn't cry when your teammate fell, but you completely broke when your dog didn't come running to you the next morning? John bowed his head slightly. He understood. He too had once lost a partner. Not a person, but another dog. The first to teach him that loyalty isn't in the police training manual. Logan leaned forward and lifted the capsule from the car hood with both hands. The way he held it wasn't like lifting an object. It was like cradling something alive. A soul, a breath, a part of himself. Some days I think I'm crazy, he said, sunlight casting across his weathered face. I talk to this thing, I say, I'm sorry, it's a bad day again. If you were alive, you'd know exactly what I need. He fell quiet for a moment, then turned to Muffin. And then you showed up, he said in a near whisper. You with those same eyes. Muffin lifted his head. His eyes, deep, brown, unwavering, locked onto the man sinking under the weight of memory. But he didn't look like a stranger. He looked as if he had been there, heard it all, seen it all. Atlas used to do this, Logan said. Sit next to me after every mission. No movement, no sleep, no food, just sat there, as if he knew exactly where I was broken and how long it would take to put me back together. He smiled, this time with a trace of moisture in the corner of his eyes. And now you're sitting here too. Muffin didn't respond, but he didn't need to. That silence was the answer. An answer deeper than any words of comfort, a presence that said everything without saying anything. John sat down beside them, not interrupting, not distancing, just quietly becoming part of the memorial circle forming between man, dog, and memory. It's happening again, Logan whispered, resting the capsule on his thigh like a head in his lap. Every time I think I've gone far enough, it comes back. Not to torment me, but to remind me. I never said goodbye. Muffin stretched forward, slowly, gently, and rested his head on Logan's thigh, right next to the capsule. For the first time in 10 years, Logan cried. He didn't scream. He didn't collapse. He simply let the tears fall onto the capsule where, for the first time, another dog had touched it. Not to warn, but to share. 10 years of silence. 10 years of locking memories away like guilt. 10 years of carrying a fallen friend without ever speaking his name. And today, thanks to a dog who knew nothing about war, had no orders, no history, he could finally exhale. It was no longer just the past. It was something allowed to live again, so it could finally be let go. Still kneeling beside the sun-heated hood, Logan held the capsule as if it had a heartbeat, as if something inside his palm was alive, breathing. Muffin lay by his feet, his head resting lightly on Logan's thigh, eyes quiet like a mirror reflecting something unnameable, something long broken that had never been spoken aloud. No one urged Logan to continue, but somehow, this moment, Muffin's silence, John's quiet presence, became an invitation. Gentle, unforced. An open door for a veteran to finally unlock what he had sealed away for a decade. Logan nodded faintly, as if accepting that invitation. His voice emerged low and steady, like a river flowing again after a long drought. And with every word, every breath, old images stepped out from the shadows of memory. It happened during the last year I was still called a soldier, he began, eyes focused on the distance, as if seeing through air thick with gunpowder. Helmand, southern Afghanistan, so dry you felt sand in your lungs just by breathing. He leaned forward and gently placed the capsule back on the hood, like a ritual before the telling. That day, the mission seemed simple. An old market, abandoned for years but suspected of being rigged with explosives. I led a 4-man team, accompanied by Atlas, our unit's detection dog. He was a German shepherd, beautiful, sharp, instinctive, but not your typical high-energy dog. Atlas was unnervingly quiet. He didn't bark, didn't need praise. As long as someone walked with him, he'd go. All the way. Logan raised his hand to his chest, as if searching for the old leash that once connected him to Atlas. But now there was only a faded thread of memory and a warm hollow in his heart. We moved in silence, like always. Tight formation, eyes scanning left and right, each man a cog in a machine that would fall apart with one wrong turn. And Atlas, he was up front, just one shadow's length ahead. Close enough for me to act if needed, far enough to stay free of human breath. He paused for a moment, then went on. He stopped in front of a collapsed wall. Looked harmless, just 2 slabs of fallen concrete forming a narrow path. But Atlas didn't go further. His ears didn't perk up, didn't droop. He just stopped. And then he turned his head. Logan swallowed hard. That look. He shook his head. I've never seen it again in my life. No fear, no hesitation, just knowing, as if in that instant, he understood exactly where he was, what was waiting, and why he had to go first. He exhaled deeply, wind rustling past as if flipping a page in a thick war journal. He didn't wait for a command, just turned to me, deep, calm eyes, and walked into the gap. A longer pause this time. And then, Logan said, his voice breaking at the end, the ground exploded. No warning. No screams. Just a violent force ripping through dust, shattering silence like a divine wind. Silent, but merciless. In Logan's eyes, the blast didn't just tear up the ground. It took with it part of his mind, part of his soul, which still hadn't come back. I was exactly 10 feet away, Logan said, clenching his fists, nails pressing into skin like a reminder of the present. Close enough to feel the heat on my face, far enough not to die, but too close not to see everything torn apart before my eyes. Muffin didn't move, though he didn't understand all the words. He felt it. He felt the tremor in the man's breath, the pain rising, not through language, but through something only dogs living beside humans could sense. A tremble in tone, a crack in armor, the scent of unhealed memory. We found a few fragments, a piece of leash, part of his vest, and some charred fur. Enough to know he was gone. Logan didn't cry, but his voice softened like damp paper. There was no ceremony, no flag box, no speeches, just me sitting there, head down, picking up every piece, every bit no one else dared to touch. He ran his hand along the capsule, gently, like soothing something sleeping inside. This is where I kept it all, not for ritual, but if I didn't bring Atlas home, no one would remember he ever lived. A soft breeze passed over the parking lot. The smell of hot asphalt, evaporating tar, and the faint tang of rust stirred the air like an echo. Logan looked at Muffin. You sit there, right next to this box, like you know who's inside. Muffin's eyes didn't leave him. And in that look, there was no instinct, no training, just a soul listening. A dog guarding something not explosive, but a heart still unrested. You don't bark, you don't react, you just stay, just like Atlas. John had remained silent all along, but something in his eyes was beginning to break, a reverence beyond words, for the man trying to speak what no one had ever understood, and for the dog quietly receiving it, as if born to do exactly that. Logan sniffed, lifted his head, eyes red but clear. That day, Atlas ran in to take my place. He saved me, and I've lived 10 years without ever saying it out loud. He placed a hand on Muffin's head. Thank you for staying, for not walking away. You're not Atlas, but maybe Atlas never really left us? Logan fell silent after the confession, as if those words had drained the last reserves of strength from within him. His hand still rested on Muffin's head, steady like a quiet period, as if he needed something to anchor, to keep him from slipping back into the dark territory he had lived in for a decade. John remained nearby, not intruding, not questioning, because in this moment any pressure would have been disrespectful. The only things that mattered were time and presence. And Muffin, somehow, had become the bridge, not just between man and dog, but between a man who had lived with silence and another who had the patience to listen to it. Logan shifted slightly, spreading his fingers to lift the capsule as if he were holding a piece of the past, a piece of his heart, a piece of his soul buried too long in unspoken pain. He stared at it for a long time, then exhaled a breath as thin as smoke, and for the first time he spoke. "You asked why I kept this for 10 years? He held the capsule up to eye level. The sunlight passed through the dull gray metal, highlighting the scratches etched across it like veins of age. "There was a time I almost ended it all." John raised his head slightly. Logan didn't look at him. His eyes stayed on the capsule. His voice came slow, deep, and warm, like a coal losing its last glow. "When I got home, I didn't feel like a person anymore. Not because of my body. I could still breathe, still eat, still talk. But inside, it was this vast emptiness that swallowed anything that tried to fill it. Every morning I woke up, I had to spend minutes just remembering where I was. Not from forgetfulness, but because I didn't want to remember." He gripped the capsule tightly. His eyes welled but didn't spill. "That night, I sat on the balcony. Gun to my right, this box to my left. The wind was strong, full moon. Everything so quiet I could hear my heart beat, and it echoed like a knock from a room nobody lived in." Muffin hadn't moved. No growls, no prompting. He simply lay there, embodying patience and empathy, something Logan once believed only existed in dreams. "I thought I was ready," Logan continued, "but before I reached for the gun, I glanced at the capsule, and I saw the name I hadn't dared say in 2 years. Atlas." He paused, as if that name still tightened his throat every time it was spoken. I opened it, for the first time since sealing it shut, and I saw everything again, each tiny piece, each fragment of the only being on Earth who understood me without needing me to speak. Slowly he opened the capsule. Inside, beneath a faded cloth, was a small bone fragment, curved like a toenail, silvered in the light. Beside it, a bit of earth, dry sand mixed with pebbles, tinged red in places like blood, long dried. And lastly, like a thread of time caught in longing, a single hair, golden brown, clinging to the cloth as if it could never leave again. "This," Logan said, voice trembling but steady, "is all I have left of Atlas. Not to memorialize, not to display, but to remind me. I still owe him one thing, to keep living." John swallowed, his throat dry, eyes glassy. But he held his composure. This was not a story for scripted reactions. He crouched, placing a hand gently on Muffin's shoulder. A silent thank you. Because if not for this dog, that capsule might have stayed closed forever. "Muffin didn't react to the scent of explosives," Logan said, as if reading John's mind. "He reacted because he sensed what hadn't been finished." John nodded. "An unfinished mission." "Exactly," Logan exhaled. "And if he's still out there somewhere, and I believe he is, then he must have sent Muffin here at the right time in the right place." Muffin gently extended his neck, touching his nose to the capsule. Not to sniff, but like a ritual. Then he sat back down in the same spot, and this time his gaze wasn't alert, but calm, like a soldier who had found the fallen banner. Logan watched the gesture, and said nothing. But his weathered face softened, as if that single act had soothed a wound no therapy session had ever touched. "You asked why I'm still alive after all these years?" Logan looked at John. "Because of this box. Not because I needed to hold it, but because it held me." John didn't answer, because in that moment there were no words that could match the weight of truth. The three of them stood there, man, dog, and memory encased in metal, forming a silent triangle, bound not by language but by something deeper, loyalty that never died, and grief never spoken aloud. And perhaps, in that soft, late afternoon light, a dog named Atlas, somehow, was sitting nearby too, keeping watch with Muffin, just like he had 10 years ago when the one he loved most needed protection. One last time. Right after that moment, when the memorial capsule was opened, when memories poured in like a gentle yet merciless flood, Muffin, without command or encouragement, suddenly leaned toward the small box. His movement wasn't rushed or dramatic. Slow, deliberate, like an old soldier returning to a battlefield. He bowed his head, lightly touched the tip of his nose to the capsule, a gesture that seemed meaningless, but instantly made both Logan and John hold their breath. Not from surprise, but because it wasn't like any behavior found in a K9 training manual. It wasn't scent checking. It wasn't tracking. It wasn't an alert to danger. It was a touch of reverence, of memory, of an invisible bond. Then, Muffin stepped back half a pace and sat down, silent, right beside the capsule, like a sentinel assigned a sacred duty. No growling, no tension. He didn't need to look at Logan or John to know what he should do. His eyes gazed into the distance, but his ears tilted toward the capsule, as if he were listening to something very old, very deep, and very familiar. John froze. He'd worked with Muffin for 3 years, long enough to know this wasn't a conditioned response. No signal had been given. No new scent had appeared. And certainly no order had been issued. But Muffin sat there, steady, loyal, and calm, as if assuming a role someone else had left behind. "Muffin?" John called softly, half question, half test. The dog didn't move. Only his ears twitched toward the sound, then returned to the capsule, as if to say, "I'm busy." Logan watched, eyes red but full of awe. "Atlas used to sit like that," he whispered. "When we built memorial markers for those we couldn't bring home, he'd keep watch all night. No one trained him, no one asked, he just knew he had to be there." Before John could respond, a figure appeared from the walkway near the VA building. A small-framed woman, arms full of folders, a name badge gleaming on her white coat. Dr. Ellen Miles. A familiar face from the PTSD unit, often working with veterans carrying deep scars. She stopped when she saw the scene. A K9 dog sitting silently by a dark metal box. 2 men nearby, one in uniform, the other in a faded t-shirt with a back hunched by unspeakable burdens. She said nothing at first, just watched. But her gaze, gentle, understanding, and precise, touched the silence like a soft blanket over a wound. "Hello, John," she said after a long pause, voice low enough not to disturb the sacred quiet Muffin had created, but clear enough to be acknowledged. "Hello, Dr. Miles," John replied with a nod. "Sorry if we're drawing attention." "No," she replied softly. "This is not something to be interrupted." Her eyes shifted to Muffin. "What is he doing?" John hesitated, then answered honestly, "I don't know, but I believe it's not trained behavior." Logan moved slightly, lifting the capsule to his chest. "It belonged to another war dog. His name was Atlas. He died in Helmand 10 years ago. This capsule holds what remains." Ellen nodded slowly. She asked no further. Logan's eyes had said enough. "Did Muffin know him?" she asked. John shook his head. "No, Atlas died years before Muffin was even born. No scent trail, no sample, nothing for Muffin to recognize, yet he sits there like he's always known." Dr. Miles stepped closer, keeping a respectful distance so Muffin wouldn't feel unsettled. "Sometimes memory isn't in images or sounds, but in emotional wavelengths. Dogs are incredibly good at sensing things we humans have no words for." She crouched, lower than both John and Logan, level with Muffin. She didn't reach out, didn't coax, only breathed gently, as if syncing herself with the rhythm of silence. Some dogs who've lived near trauma know how to spot it in others, as if they share a genetic code. Not by blood, but by empathy deeper than instinct. John looked at Muffin and realized the dog's eyes weren't those of a soldier on duty anymore. They were the eyes of a friend, standing in for someone, guarding a goodbye that had never been fully said. And he understood. This wasn't a scene for reports, not a detail for a patrol log, but a moment, singular and sacred, where a dog was no longer a tool, but a bridge between generations, between griefs, between souls, one living, one gone, but never truly apart. And in that moment, where a tiny capsule was being guarded by a dog who knew nothing of war and a man carrying a past that had never healed, time seemed to stop. But the world, no matter how much it respects pain, still runs on its own rules. The radio on John's belt crackled softly. A tense voice broke through the static. Unit 7, VA security confirms a suspicious object in the east parking lot. Hold the scene. Federal agents en route. John frowned. His eyes flicked toward a young security officer standing not far away, clearly new on the job, his hand clutching the radio. He was trying to appear calm, but his gaze towards the capsule was more suspicious than respectful. Maybe from a distance, through a radio description, all they'd heard was, "Unidentified metal object, unusual scent reaction from K9." And by standard protocol, that always fell under federal jurisdiction. Logan tensed slightly. His hand gripped the capsule, not from fear, but from familiarity. He knew this feeling well, when your pain, once brought into the open, became something the world viewed with suspicion. "FBI?" he asked, trying to keep his voice level. John didn't answer right away. He glanced between the capsule, Muffin, still sitting completely, like a graveyard sentinel, and Logan, now facing something he never asked for: doubt. "Protocol," John said finally, slowly. "When a dog alerts, especially on federal medical grounds, we're required to notify. They have jurisdiction to investigate anything potentially explosive." Logan nodded, but the brief smile that passed across his lips held no humor. "I brought back the memory of a soul who once saved my life," he said, not looking at anyone, speaking into the wind, "and now it might be taken away to determine whether it's a threat." John bowed his head. He understood better than most. A lifetime in law enforcement, especially in K9, had taught him there are boundaries between procedure and truth, and sometimes they never meet. "Muffin didn't alert," John said, almost as if reminding himself. "He's guarding." Dr. Ellen Miles from the VA stepped forward, her expression concerned but gentle. "I can speak to them if needed," she said. "I'm confident there's no danger in that capsule, and I believe Logan isn't a man who needs surveillance." "Thank you," Logan replied softly. "But they're not coming for testimony. They're coming for sensors and hazmat suits." In the distance, a black SUV pulled up. No sirens, but unmistakably fast. Two men in plain clothes stepped out, quick and precise, their eyes scanning every detail: the capsule, Muffin, the veteran. One of them powered on a handheld electronic device, scanning from a distance. A soft beep followed. John stepped forward as they approached. "He's one of mine," John said firmly. "And that object isn't a bomb. It's a memorial capsule from a K9 combat dog who died in Helmand, Afghanistan." "We don't question your intent," one of the agents responded, his tone not hostile but firm. "But we have to verify. Your dog reacted, and per regulation we're required to secure the object for examination before we can clear it as safe." John looked at Muffin. Still motionless, still as if rooted into the earth. John lowered his head. Not out of submission to authority, but to search inside himself for something deeper. Could he trust the instinct, the bond he'd built with this dog over 3 years? He turned to Logan, who was no longer defensive, no longer bracing himself. He simply waited, not pleading, not protesting, just waiting to see whether, for once, the world might believe that what he held wasn't a danger, but a memory. "Muffin wasn't wrong," John said slowly, but there was no alert. He didn't react like he does to bombs. No pacing, no signal of risk. He responded like he recognized something deeper. A connection. The agent exchanged glances with his partner. It was clear they didn't want to argue on site, but neither could they ignore protocol. "We'll take it, handle it with care, and return it if cleared," one of them said, producing a standard-issue evidence bag. Logan looked at John. He didn't speak. Just one look, carrying both resistance and resignation. John took a deep breath, crouched beside Muffin. "You okay?" he asked softly. The dog didn't respond, but glanced once more at the capsule, then returned to his still posture. And in that moment, just as John reached out his hand, Muffin let out a low whine. Not loud, not a warning, more like a quiet, sorrowful sigh. John froze, and he understood. It wasn't that the capsule was dangerous. It wasn't that Muffin was resisting authority. It was that, in that moment, Muffin knew they were about to take something he couldn't protect. The one thing he had chosen to guard. The one thing that had made a dog like Muffin, trained to separate duty from emotion, break every rule and do just one thing: stay. Muffin's soft whine still echoed in Logan's mind, persistent, like a call from somewhere too far to return to, yet too near to leave behind. And as the capsule was sealed inside the specialized bag, as silence grew too heavy to bear, memory returned. This time, not death. This time, the beginning. The air at Coronado Base always hung thick with sweat, chalk dust, and steel. The Southern California sun poured heat over every muddy path and sand incline, as if testing not only the body but the will of anyone aspiring to wear the SEAL insignia. Logan was 27 then, lean, quiet, reserved, but tough as stone. He wasn't the fastest, strongest, or most noticeable, but there was one thing that made him impossible to weed out. He never stopped. It was week 6 of training, the infamous Hell Friday, when the unit was first introduced to the K9’s. "Don't think of these as regular dogs," the instructor barked, leading a line of 4 German shepherds, each with eyes like veterans of a dozen campaigns. "They're not pets, they're teammates." Logan didn't know what to expect, but among them, one dog, slightly smaller, dark brown with a black streak down its spine, stepped forward. Atlas. Not yet 3 years old, yet his eyes were aged, almost contemplative. When released from the leash, Atlas didn't bark or show off. He simply stood still, observed, and his gaze found Logan like a thread pulled tight. Not the stare of a wild animal, but the look of a soldier silently asking, "Can you keep up with me?" Training began with basic drills, obstacle runs, scent tracking, and exposure to gunfire. Atlas didn't need a second try to understand the commands, but what caught Logan's eye wasn't the speed or skill. It was how Atlas never once looked at the other dogs. No distractions, no play, no deviation. One day, during a session, something happened. One of the instructors, a man who had served in Fallujah, collapsed mid-field. His heart had stopped. No one spoke, but everyone knew. He was gone. Logan, standing closest, was stunned, frozen. And then, something unexpected. Atlas, nearly 20 meters away, suddenly stopped. No command, no cue. He turned, walked toward the instructor's fallen helmet, dropped in the fall, and sat beside it. He didn't move, didn't bow, didn't bark, just sat, as if standing guard. And in that moment the entire base fell silent. No one stepped forward. No one dared touch the helmet, because somehow everyone understood. That was Atlas's job now. Only after the body was removed and the helmet packed away did Atlas rise, calmly returning to his training spot. No reward needed, no approving nod. And from that day forward, Logan was paired with Atlas. No reason was given by the instructors, but Logan understood. Atlas had chosen him, not for skill, but for the eyes. Because when 2 quiet souls recognize each other's pain, it isn't a pairing, it's a continuation. Back to the present, the parking lot bathed in pale golden light. Muffin still sat. The capsule was gone, But in his eyes, John saw no resentment, no fear, only a steadfast resolve without a name, as if he were still fulfilling a duty passed down to him. Wordlessly, Logan exhaled, glancing at John. "Atlas used to do that," he said, voice low as wind rustling through trees. "No one told him to, but he knew. Some losses need guarding, not because someone might attack, but because too few still remember." John said nothing. He simply knelt, gently stroked Muffin's back, and for the first time during his entire shift, didn't check his watch. Because some moments aren't measured in minutes or seconds, but in silence and loyalty. And in that late afternoon, as the last sunbeams stretched across the empty parking lot, the memory of Atlas still hung suspended between Logan and the world, a thread unbroken, pulled taut by the doubt humans reserve for what cannot be measured by logic. The room behind the VA hospital's administration wing, temporarily repurposed for handling security incidents, held nothing remarkable. A metal table, two facing chairs, an unopened water bottle. An air conditioner was humming so faintly it might not have existed. But the air was thick, not with suspicion, but with pain under scrutiny. Logan sat upright, hands folded neatly on the table. He wasn't handcuffed. No one yelled, but the agent across from him had eyes as sharp as a scalpel, each question delivered like a probing stitch, seeking some hidden truth they believed was buried beneath the surface. "Did you know the capsule contained traces of ammonium perchlorate?" the agent asked. His voice wasn't aggressive, but carried the wariness forged from years dealing with threats. Logan stayed silent. His gaze didn't flinch, nor did it rush to justify. "We're not jumping to conclusions," the agent went on. "But you understand, bringing an undeclared item with explosive residue into federal grounds, especially a VA hospital, has serious consequences." Logan looked down at his hands. A small scar ran along his thumb, long healed. No one would ask about it, but to him, it recalled the day he dug bare-handed through the dirt, collecting the remains of Atlas. No device could detect the pain that flowed from that scar back to his heart. "I didn't bring a bomb," Logan said, low but clear. "I brought a memory." The agent looked up. No notes, no reply. "That capsule," Logan continued, his eyes focusing somewhere beyond the wall, "is all I have left of a dog who saved my life. I don't keep it because it's dangerous. I keep it because without it, I'm not myself." The door creaked open. John stepped in. He didn't need to speak. Just his gaze, steady, certain, unwavering, shifted the entire tone of the room. A signal not transmitted by radio or found in security reports, but born from something veterans rarely articulate: instinct and loyalty. "I confirm," John said, "that Muffin's behavior wasn't an alert. No sign of explosives, no aggression. He identified a scent from the past." "You're sure?" the agent asked, still level. "I'm not sure about the chemistry," John replied, "but I'm sure about my dog. Muffin sat beside that capsule the same way K9’s are trained to guard fallen teammates. There was no confusion in his behavior. Only humans, too often, fail to grasp what dogs already understand." The agent looked at both men, one no longer in uniform, carrying a memory like luggage no one dared open. The other a cop who made no arguments, only stood nearby like a shadow of unconditional trust. Finally, the agent exhaled and closed his notebook. "We'll keep the capsule for 24 hours to complete the analysis. If nothing unusual is found, it will be returned." Logan nodded. No complaint. But his eyes still followed something that had been taken away, as if a piece of Atlas's soul was locked inside some cold lab where no one knew how to listen. When Logan stepped out of the interrogation room, the sky had started to dim. The parking lot was nearly empty, only a few cars resting under the flag now limp in the wind. Muffin was still there. John hadn't called. The dog stood as soon as Logan appeared, walked over slowly, steadily, without a bark, without a reaction. He simply approached and lightly touched his head to Logan's hand. No one had taught him that. And for the first time that entire afternoon, Logan lowered his head and rested his forehead gently against Muffin's. A small gesture, no photo, no recording, no report, but John knew, clearer than ever. This wasn't an investigation. It was a journey to reopen a door long sealed by pain. As the sunset angled low over the weathered roof of the administrative wing, its pale golden light settled across the concrete sidewalk where Logan had just stepped out from the interrogation room. The world seemed to quiet, giving way to a silence not easily named. Logan paused on the first step, where Muffin still stood waiting. Not anxious, not uncertain. Just there, eyes fixed on the door like a soldier waiting for a comrade to return from the front. John hadn't told him to wait. No one had. Logan approached slowly, bending slightly, an unconscious habit. When Muffin stepped forward, he gently nudged Logan's side, a gesture so small it could be missed unless one was watching with their heart. But to Logan, it was the touch of a living soul. No words, no pity, just presence, and a quiet understanding that sometimes even humans couldn't offer one another. Everything seemed to settle again until the second black SUV arrived. No sirens, no rush, but it carried something Logan had hoped never to see again since leaving the unit: systemic control. 2 federal agents stepped out, their expressions neutral faces seemingly molded from policy and protocol. The first, likely the senior, carried the evidence bag containing the capsule. The younger agent moved quickly, powering on a handheld scanner, sweeping the area with clinical precision, as if he were inspecting a parcel rather than holding a man's last tether to a fallen friend. Logan stepped back, not in fear, but because he could feel something inside himself being peeled open again. That fragile thread, once stitched together with a bone fragment, dry soil, and a single dog hair, was being handled now by gloved hands unaware of what they held. John moved instinctively, reaching to take Muffin's leash, but before he could, something unexpected happened. Muffin stepped forward. There was no aggression in his step, no tension, no trained reflex of threat or engagement. He simply walked forward, deliberate, steady, with purpose, as if, in his world, something important was missing, something not yet set right. He stopped right in front of the 2 agents, standing between them and Logan. He didn't lower his stance, didn't raise his hackles, didn't bark. He just stood there, poised like a royal guard, like a living statue carved from loyalty and that ancient canine intuition that once brought wolves into the lives of men. Not to hunt, but to remember. For a few seconds, the younger agent furrowed his brow, hesitating as if expecting a more recognizable reaction. But the older one, more seasoned, did not move. His eyes rested on Muffin's upright ears and unwavering stance, and he understood. This wasn't defiance. It was a message. No one had commanded Muffin. No one had taught him grief or memory. But somehow he knew the thing in that bag wasn't just metal and trace compounds. It was a promise, sealed with tears and silence. A final piece of a soul lost too soon to have a grave. John stepped forward, ready to call Muffin back, but Logan's voice came first. Calm, low, not pleading, but almost like reciting an old memory. "Atlas used to do that," he said, eyes on Muffin. "The day we received the last cap of a fallen teammate. No one told him, but Atlas walked over, sat beside it, and didn't move for 10 minutes. We didn't understand until one of the soldiers' wives approached, and Atlas stepped back, as if he knew it was time to hand it over." The older agent looked at Logan for a long moment. Not with doubt, but with a slow internal shift. Some rules must be followed, but some moments don't exist in any handbook. And sometimes, a dog who doesn't growl says more than any sworn testimony. "You're certain?" the agent asked, more softly now. "Certain that this isn't a threat?" Logan didn't answer right away. He stepped forward, standing beside Muffin. Not too close, not taking his place, but as if joining him on the line. "I'm certain," he said gently. "Because if it were a threat, Muffin wouldn't be standing here." A pause. Wind fluttered the flag above the main gate, casting a wavering shadow on the concrete. In that moment, there were no agents, no chain of command, only an invisible circle connecting 3 lives: a veteran, a dog, and the memory of a friend long gone. Finally, the older agent nodded slowly, as if needing to convince himself that this was not the time to wound a man clinging to the sacred. "Muffin," John said, voice like wind. "It's okay." The dog turned, looked at John, then back at Logan, his eyes holding no obedience, no hesitation, only the question, "Are you sure?" And when Logan gave a small nod, Muffin slowly stepped back, returning to John's side. The world might call it a trained reflex, but everyone who stood there that day knew otherwise. It was a final act of protection offered by a soul who had never met Atlas, but who could still hear his echo in every breath of air. And as Muffin quietly returned to John's side, knowing somehow that the final watch had been acknowledged and trusted, the atmosphere around the administrative building softened a degree. The older agent exchanged a quiet glance with his partner, then gave a subtle nod, as if confirming something that could never be put into a report. Logan remained standing, silent, carrying the look of a man who had just walked out of a trial, not in a courtroom, but one rendered by the weight of his conscience. John laid a hand on Muffin's head, tracing his spine in a slow stroke, and prepared to leave, until a hoarse voice rang out from the far end of the corridor. Not rushed, but clear, like a knock on a door someone had accidentally left ajar. That dog wasn't wrong. All heads turned. From the hallway beside the recovery unit, an older man walked toward them. His gait was uneven, but his frame retained the sturdy bearing of someone shaped by drills, deployments, and midnight raids. A worn khaki shirt tucked neatly into military-issue trousers, salt and pepper hair combed back, and eyes, those eyes, unchanged by war, steady, deep, and carrying a kind of sincerity that cannot be faked. John recognized him first. "Martinez," he murmured. Logan turned, surprised. "He's a retired K9 officer," John nodded. "One of the original trainers for the Federal Tracking Dog Unit. Long retired." Martinez stopped, his eyes landing on Muffin, then slowly shifting to Logan. It was not a look of judgment or inspection, but recognition. The look of someone who had once stood exactly where Logan was now, between memory and pain, torn between holding on and letting go. "I heard a dog was reacting to something supposedly harmless," he said, easing himself onto a bench as if preparing to share something long kept. "I had one like that. His name was Hero. 11 years ago, he was stabbed to death during a raid. He detected a suspect before anyone else saw it, saved 3 men, died in my arms." No one spoke. "I kept his last leash," Martinez continued, gripping the air over his chest as if holding something invisible. "It wasn't explosive, wasn't evidence, but twice I brought it through airport security, and both times a K9 stopped. Not to alert, but to stand guard. Just like this one." He looked at Muffin, his gaze softening. "Because some things don't carry danger. They carry a soul." Logan looked up. In his eyes, John saw something he'd never seen before. Acknowledgement. Not urgent pain, not defensive grief, but the quiet recognition of meeting someone who knew exactly the burden he'd carried for 10 years. "You think they can feel it?" Logan asked, voice raspy, as if asking for Atlas, for himself, and Muffin too. "I don't think," Martinez said. "I know." He leaned down, looked Muffin in the face, and spoke. Not loudly, not ceremoniously, but as if telling a trusted friend, "You saw what we've buried under layers of logic." Muffin didn't respond as he usually might. He simply stepped forward, touched his head gently to the old man's hand, a slow, deliberate gesture. And for the first time since that morning, Logan smiled. Not bright, not free, but the kind of smile that comes when you finally realize you're not the only one who grieves this way. Twilight had fallen. The corridor lights began to overtake the last daylight. Logan stood straighter now. The weight had eased from his shoulders, and when John stepped beside him, they didn't need words. because a door had opened. And this time, not to interrogate, but to let the light in. Since the day Martinez sat with them on the hospital steps, that afternoon had closed like a book gently returned to the shelf, not because the story had ended, but because someone had just turned to a new page. The following Tuesday, Logan returned to the PTSD therapy room in the east wing of the VA hospital. A small space, pale gray walls, always faintly scented with antiseptic and stale coffee. The chairs were arranged in a circle, not perfectly aligned, as if each person was also sitting at a distance not from others, but from their pain and their readiness to face it. Logan always arrived early, choosing the seat near the window, left side. He never interrupted others' stories, never left mid-session. He came, sat, listened, as though simply being there, quietly, was how he kept himself from falling off the edge. The group leader, a former military psychologist named Ruben, was composed and calm. He never forced anyone to speak before they were ready. He called Logan by his first name, not Patient Granger, not Seal Granger, just Logan, the way people do when walking together through darkness. That week, there was a new face. A young man, not yet 30, with thin, sun-weathered skin, left arm covered in a tattoo of coordinates and 2 names. He didn't say much, just introduced himself as Matt. He sat 2 seats from Logan, near the table with the water jug and a bowl of soft cookies. When his turn came to share, Matt's voice trembled like a pulled wire. "My dad died in Afghanistan. Not in the same era as you guys, but I know war doesn't end when the soldier leaves the battlefield." Logan tilted his head slightly, eyes down on the floor. Every time someone spoke of loss, he listened, but he had never once spoken about his own. They were used to his silence, accepted it like gravity. Some thought he was proud. Others thought he was afraid of unleashing memories too painful to control. But the truth was, Logan wasn't sure he could say the name without breaking apart. The meeting slowed as it neared the hour mark. Matt grabbed a peppermint from a small jar, then stood to leave early. As he passed Logan, his eyes caught something glinting on Logan's lap. The capsule, returned the day before, now rewrapped in its aged cloth and resting quietly on his knee. Matt stopped, didn't speak. Logan looked up. Their eyes met, only for a second, but long enough for Matt to recognize the same look he'd seen in his mother's eyes whenever she opened the drawer holding the last photo of his father. "May I touch it?" Matt asked softly, not breaking the gentle quiet in the room. No one pushed. It was less a question of permission than an invitation to approach not just an object, but a memory long sealed. Logan nodded slightly. Matt sat beside him, leaned forward, and touched the cloth lightly with 2 fingertips. He didn't unwrap it, didn't examine. He simply laid his palm against the worn fabric. "What was his name?" Matt asked. His voice was barely more than a breeze. Not demanding, just a whisper for someone standing on the other side of this world. Logan didn't answer. His eyelids fluttered, but no tears fell. Not because the pain was gone, but because the storm within had finally begun to settle. Just enough to allow the question to land without shattering him. In the stillness, a small sound stirred. The soft inhale of Muffin, lying quietly under Logan's chair since the start of the session. No one in the group was surprised by his presence anymore. Muffin had been allowed to attend after Ruben noticed that with the dog by his side, Logan sat straighter, breathed deeper, and left the room with lighter steps. Muffin didn't approach the capsule. He simply raised his head and looked directly at Matt, as if he sensed something in the hand resting on that cloth. A grief unnamed, but known. And in that gaze, something passed. A name, a soul, a memory waiting to be acknowledged. Matt pulled his hand back. Didn't ask anything else. He turned to Logan and smiled. Not with joy, but with the understanding of someone who had just brushed against something sacred. The group remained silent, but no one felt that silence was empty. Because, for the first time in months, Logan didn't withdraw when someone asked about the fallen. He didn't speak, but he stayed until the end. The capsule remained on his lap. Muffin stayed at his feet, and something in the room had changed, as if the door between two worlds had been cracked open. And from that afternoon on, when Logan didn't shy away from the question of a name, something within him shifted. Not abruptly, not visibly, but like a door long sealed had been quietly unlocked, just enough for a sliver of light to slip in. He didn't speak anymore, didn't touch the capsule often, but his gaze, since then, no longer looked away. And for the group, that alone was enough to count as a beginning. 1 week later, in the same room, faded paint, a ring of chairs, soft yellow light from overhead fixtures, Logan took his usual seat. The capsule was no longer on his lap, but the cloth pouch lay folded in his jacket pocket, right over his chest. Matt was there too, sitting a little closer. No one mentioned last week. But the silence held a quiet agreement. What mattered wasn't what was said, but who was brave enough to come back. A few minutes before they started, the door creaked open. John stepped in, scanning the room discreetly before nodding at Reuben to signal he was here unofficially. But it wasn't John who drew the room's attention. It was the four-legged form that followed behind, steady and serene, eyes sharp yet soft like mirrors for every emotion in the room. Muffin. There was something in his gait that calmed the air instantly. Not the pride of a K9 on duty, but the gentle presence of an old friend returning, with memories, with history, and with a heart that knew when to be quiet. Reuben said nothing, just smiled and nodded, as if welcoming a long-time member back into the circle. John took a seat near the door, hand lightly resting on the leash. Not that he needed to. Muffin didn't patrol the room, didn't sniff people's legs. After a moment's pause, he walked straight toward Logan. Every eye followed him, as if the entire room held its breath, waiting for a connection they couldn't name. Logan shifted slightly, instinctively guarded, but Muffin gave him no time to react. He stopped directly in front of him, didn't bark, didn't sniff. He simply laid his head gently on Logan's thigh. No sound, no command, no extra movement, just the purest form of presence. Muffin's eyes looked up into Logan's, and in that look was something ancient, something almost outside of time. No one in the room could define it, but they all felt it. This wasn't just a dog reading someone's emotions. This was an invisible thread stretching from past to present, from Logan's memories to the living, breathing creature touching him now. Logan froze for a few seconds, not from fear, but from something harder to name, something weaving its way through the softness of fur under his hand. Then, as if pulled by a force deep in his memory, Logan reached down and gently touched Muffin's head. No petting, no stroking, just a touch. A long breath slipped from his chest, light as silk, but carrying something heavy that had been there too long. Silence. Matt was the first to speak. "He looks like the one you once mentioned," he murmured, as if to himself. Logan didn't reply, but this time he didn't pull his hand away. Reuben watched from across the room. He opened his notebook, but wrote nothing. He simply leaned forward slightly and said, warm and slow, "Sometimes, empathy doesn't come from someone who's heard our voice, but from someone or something who simply knows how to be near." Muffin didn't move for the rest of the session. He lay there, head still on Logan's leg, eyes closed as if guarding a fragile dream. No one dared call it unusual, because everyone knew. Some connections don't need explanation, and don't ask for it. They just ask to be believed. At the end of the session, as people filed out, Logan still hadn't stood. His hand still rested at Muffin's neck, as if holding on to a silent warmth. Then he looked at John, and for the first time began a sentence he didn't abandon midway. His name was Atlas. His voice wasn't loud, wasn't firm, but it carried the weight of a beginning. The beginning of a story is ready to be told. As the final sounds of the therapy session faded into the stillness of the late afternoon, with only a few rays of sunlight filtering through the narrow window, Logan remained motionless. His hand rested lightly on Muffin's head, as if afraid that letting go would mean losing the last warmth tethered to his past. But perhaps it was precisely Muffin's quiet presence, unwavering, unintrusive, that allowed Logan, for the first time in 10 years, to stop guarding everything inside like some forgotten keeper of a sacred vault. Then, in a moment that seemed to hold the entire room's breath, he opened his mouth. Slowly, strained, but truthful. Atlas. His voice cracked like dry wood under the weight of memory. He saved my life. No one in the group made a sound. Those sitting in the circle, Matt, Reuben, and 3 or 4 other veterans, looked at Logan, not with the eyes of people waiting for a story, but with the understanding of those who knew exactly what it meant when someone finally said the name of the one they lost. Logan bowed his head, his fingers gently pressing into the soft fur at Muffin's neck, and for the first time, tears traced the contours of his sun-worn face. We were in Helmand. No moon that night. Atlas was ahead of the team by about 10 paces. I was the team leader, keeping him in sight. When he found the IED, he didn't bark, didn't turn, just froze. His voice was steady. No dramatics, no forced emotion. But in that calm, low rhythm, each word dropped like glass shards underfoot in the corridors of memory. I signaled the team to halt, and then a secondary device went off on the right. Atlas... He paused, inhaling sharply as if pulling back a still sharp image. He ran straight at me. Not by command, not by instinct. He just knew. Logan's grip tightened, his eyes blurred behind the veil of tears. He chose that spot, so I could live. An older man in the group, Gerald, who had served in Iraq, slowly reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a small item, a faded military dog tag on a worn, short chain. He said nothing at first, just held it in both hands, raised it gently to chest height, and looked at Logan. My girl was named Ruby, Gerald said, his voice rough but sure. A Labrador. Died saving a family during a sweep near Mosul. I keep her tag next to my bed every night. One by one, eyes around the circle met. No one was forced to speak. But something rare happened. When one man found the courage to say the pain he'd buried, the others didn't feel fear. They felt permission. Matt bowed his head, tracing tiny circles on his knee with his finger. My dad died when I was 12. He had a dog named Ranger. My mom told me later that when we got the call, Ranger lay by the front door for 3 days, didn't eat, just waited like he knew who wouldn't be coming back. Logan looked up. His eyes still held tears, but now they no longer braced for collapse. Instead, there was the look of a man who'd finally set his burden down, and discovered it didn't explode like he'd feared. Muffin lifted his head from Logan's leg and approached Gerald's hand. He sniffed the dog tag gently, not intrusively, then sat at Gerald's feet, his eyes rising with an unspoken acknowledgement. I understand. Gerald leaned forward, placed a hand on Muffin's head, and smiled. A soft smile, like someone seeing an old friend in a new form. Reuben, the group leader, turned a page in his notebook, but didn't write. He simply looked around the room, then said softly, "We often believe healing begins when we find the right words. But sometimes, what we need to find isn't language. It's a glance that listens, a gesture that doesn't demand, or a name spoken at the right time." Logan nodded faintly. "Atlas," he repeated, clearer now, as if calling him. His name was Atlas. And if I'm still here, it's because he never really left. The room fell into a special kind of silence. Not heavy, but sacred, like a small ceremony had just taken place, with just enough reverence, just enough light, and just enough human grace. When it came time to leave, Logan carried the capsule in both hands, as if it no longer just held memory, but had become a shared, acknowledged truth. No more hiding it under his chair. No more fearing others' eyes. Muffin walked beside him. No leash, no commands. Just 2 souls, each having lost part of their hearts, finding each other in a moment of mutual understanding that transcended species. When the door softly clicked shut behind that day's session, and the folding chairs were quietly stowed, Matt's parting glance at the capsule held the hue of a whispered thank you. Logan remained seated a while longer. The small, cloth-wrapped item on his lap no longer felt like an isolated weight, but something shared, a truth finally acknowledged. The next day, Logan sat outside the treatment center, on the same stone bench beneath the wide oak canopy, where the rustling leaves made you believe time still waited for those not yet ready to move forward. As always, the capsule was with him, not to display or prove anything, but like a second heartbeat pressed near his chest, one he had feared for 10 years that if he let go, he'd vanish with it. The familiar sound of footsteps came from his right, slow and deliberate. Logan didn't turn. He knew this wasn't a routine check or coincidence. It was a meeting with intent. And as always, Muffin padded silently beside John, tail not wagging with excitement, but swinging gently like breath, like the rhythm of a soul that knows how to listen. John didn't sit immediately. He stood a few paces away, holding a folded slip of paper. "VA's hosting a memorial this Saturday," John said. His voice carried neither command nor suggestion, just an offering. The biggest of the year, for those who gave everything, and those who made it back. That last phrase, "those who made it back," wasn't a formality. It was a definition Logan had never truly allowed for himself. For him, survival had never felt like a victory. It felt like walking through scorched ground, with every footprint still echoing his team's breath and Atlas's last heartbeat. John extended the paper. No pressure, no urgency. Logan took it, eyes not yet on the content, only on the embossed phrase across the white, "To honor all who serve." An old slogan, but this time it stung just a little at the bridge of his nose. "I brought it because I thought," John said slowly, "maybe this time you'd want to bring the capsule." Logan stayed quiet, didn't refuse, but didn't answer. His fingers curled slightly, creasing the paper's edge. He looked up through the tangle of oak leaves at a pale blue patch of sky. "For the first time," he murmured, "I'd carry it out into the light, not hide it under a chair, not stuff it deep in my pack." John nodded, as if he knew exactly what Logan was confronting. Not the grief, but the fear of being seen still holding it. After a pause, Logan exhaled, then whispered, "What if I cry?" It wasn't weakness, it was a ritual, like a warrior laying down his weapon, not in surrender, but to show he's no longer fighting his own heart. John replied softly, almost a whisper, "Then maybe for the first time, you're alive." In that moment, those words weren't comforting. They were permission, spoken by someone who understood that being alive isn't measured by heartbeat or motion, but by daring to feel the pain you thought you couldn't carry any longer. At that, Muffin lifted his head, nuzzled Logan's palm, not asking for affection, not demanding anything, just reminding him, "If you're not alone, then crying is part of the victory." Logan bowed his head. For the first time, he nodded, not to anyone else, but to himself. That night, in the small back room of his rented apartment near the hospital, he quietly opened the cloth pouch. The capsule remained intact, wrapped in the frayed fabric cut from Atlas's last field shirt. He didn't open it. He didn't need to. He placed it gently on the table, sat down, and let the desk lamp shine over its surface. For the first time, looking at it without flinching. He didn't cry. He didn't collapse. He simply looked as if whispering a promise. This weekend we'll step out into the sunlight together. And just as he'd silently promised in that quiet room days ago on Saturday morning, Logan Granger stepped into the light, not hiding in the long corridors of the VA center, not buried in the silent stillness of old pain, but standing tall in the middle of a small square filled with flags and neat rows of chairs beneath the June sun. He wasn't in uniform, wore no medals, just a simple sand-colored shirt and faded khaki pants. But in his left hand, held close to his chest like a sacred relic, was the capsule, wrapped in old military fabric, no longer frayed, now folded crisp and precise, like a small flag. And at his right, sinking breath and step, walked Muffin, quiet as a shadow, steady as a memory that never left. No one had asked Logan to speak that day. He wasn't on the official program. But as the coordinator prepared to close the open mic, John, standing by the security detail, raised his hand, stepped forward, and spoke into the mic in a calm, steady voice. "There's someone silent for a very long time. Today he chose to speak." Logan stepped up. Not quickly, not hesitantly, not like a seasoned speaker, but not like someone being forced either. Just a man who had decided to lift his head, carry a piece of the past, and place it gently into the daylight. Not to forget, but to be seen. He stood at the microphone, the capsule still in his hands. A soft breeze passed through the flags dotting the square. Some in the front rows, veterans, nurses, family, recognized him. Their eyes carried no judgment, no impatience. Just the kind of rare patience reserved for those who have lost more than just limbs. Logan took a deep breath. "I'm Logan Granger," he began, voice raspy but steady. "I served in Afghanistan, SEAL Team 6. Atlas was the name of the most extraordinary teammate I ever had." He paused. A hush fell, thin as linen. He was a K9. A few people nodded. Some closed their eyes, memories rising like old echoes. "He saved my life," Logan continued, voice firmer now. "And because he died, I spent the next 10 years not knowing how to keep living." He glanced down at the capsule. "I used to think I had to carry this alone," Logan said, eyes gleaming but steady. "That memory was a burden reserved for the living, that I had no right to set it down if I hadn't repaid the debt of survival." The breeze flipped the hem of his shirt back. At that moment, Muffin sat down beside his leg, uncommanded, untrained, like an instinct telling him this was the moment to let memory stand beside life. But today, Logan's eyes lifted, scanning the crowd. Matt, Gerald, others still learning how to live with ghosts of their own. "I see he's still here." He raised the capsule to his chest. Not too high. Not for display, more like an introduction. Gentle, reverent. "Atlas isn't buried anywhere. He lives in the way I walk, the way I remember his name, the way I thank each breath I still get to take." The crowd shifted, not restlessly, but in the way people do when holding back waves too long unnamed. Tissue met eyes. Breaths deepened, but no one interrupted him. "I know some of you have names you've never dared to say out loud, eyes that looked at you from memory and never returned. Four-legged comrades, breaths that once curled beside you in tents, noses that sensed death before the blast ever came." For a brief moment, Logan's eyes brimmed. "If I cry today," he said, smiling faintly as he tightened his grip on the capsule, "it's because, for the first time, I'm truly living." And at that very moment, Muffin stepped forward, rested his head on Logan's foot, and looked up, silent, steady, as if Atlas himself was speaking from somewhere unnamed. "I'm still here. I saw you find your way back." There was no thunderous applause, but nods, trembling breaths, gentle touches on shoulders, enough for Logan to know he was no longer alone in this journey. For the first time in 10 years, the capsule wasn't hidden beneath a chair, wasn't guarded like a secret, but stood among others, a monument cracked open. And in the bright sunlight of that ceremony, a man who once believed he'd lost everything finally called back the name of an old friend, not just with his voice, but with a heart that had found its way out of silence. As Logan stepped down from the podium, sunlight still caught in his eyes and reflected in the hearts stilled by ceremony, the capsule in his hands was no longer a symbol of grief alone, but of memory validated by light, words, and the living empathy surrounding him. He didn't look back at the stage. He didn't need to. What needed saying had been said, and what needed keeping still beat gently beneath his hand. And then, in that space that had gone quiet with something close to reverence, Muffin moved. No command, no gesture. John, standing quietly on the other side of the square, barely had time to track him as Muffin left Logan's side and stepped softly up the wooden platform where the capsule had been gently set when Logan bowed to the crowd. The entire square held its breath. Even the air paused. Muffin, unlike any K9 in tactical precision, approached not with alertness or suspicion. No hurried sniffing, no anxious checking. He simply stepped forward and sat, slowly, solemnly, still, his front paws rested parallel. Tail curled neatly, head bowed slightly, as though Muffin wasn't sitting by an object, but guarding a soul. The entire ceremony froze. No children fidgeted. No gusts of wind swept chairs. Not even a stray cough dared break the moment. Everyone, instinctively, understood. This was a ritual. Wordless. Sacred. And no one would interrupt. Muffin's eyes were wide, but not fixed on anyone present. He looked out, beyond the metal, beyond the cloth, as if through that small shell he could see the shape of another German shepherd. Larger, darker coated, still on watch in a space between the living and the lost. A young woman in the second row put her hand to her chest. A tear slipped, but her face held a strange peace. Beside her, an 8-year-old boy tugged her sleeve and whispered, his voice just loud enough to pass through the sacred quiet. "Mom, I think that dog understands something." The mother didn't answer. She only stroked his hair and bowed her head. A few rows back, Gerald, the veteran who'd lost both legs in Kandahar, raised his hand in a military salute. His hand trembled with age, but not hesitation. The salute wasn't for Logan, nor for the capsule, but for the dog carrying out the most solemn ritual he'd witnessed since the day he left the service. Logan didn't move. His heart no longer coiled in pain, but pulsed with a sharp, honest clarity. Atlas had never truly gone. He had simply changed form, swapped bark for silence, instinct for presence. And today, that presence was sitting right in front of him, embodied in a dog whose name would never appear in history books, but whose soul bore the intuition of a true soldier. John stepped forward quietly. He didn't disrupt the sanctity, only moved beside Muffin and laid a hand gently on his back, not to lead him away, but to stand with him. In his eyes was not the gaze of a K9 officer, but of a man who had seen things no logic could explain, and was humble enough not to try. Muffin remained seated for several minutes. He didn't shift, didn't seek praise, didn't expect a reward. And then, as the first breeze returned, lifting a white ribbon from a young man's hand at the edge of the crowd, Muffin stood, softly, like breath. He walked back to Logan, not triumphantly, not dramatically, but as someone who had just completed a quiet mission at exactly the right time. In the days that followed, many would recount the moment. Some would call it instinct. Others wouldn't know what to call it, but they would remember that gaze, that presence. In that fleeting second when hearts softened, when truth stood bare and tender, everyone there had touched the same sacred thing, a love that never broke. And when the last row of chairs was folded away, the flags neatly squared, and the loudspeakers went silent, the memorial plaza slowly emptied. Shadows drifted across the stone as people left quietly in the golden hour, leaving behind an atmosphere suspended between solemnity and release, as if the space itself exhaled one final breath after the sacred moment had passed. Logan remained. He chose the last seat in the row, unnoticed, leaning against the shade of an old oak tree. The capsule lay lightly in his palm, its worn fabric still holding the warmth of a time long gone. No one was looking anymore. No one is waiting for a speech. No one was expecting him to stay strong. And in that hush, for the first time, he sat with Atlas, not as a hidden memory, but as a quiet presence finally allowed. Muffin lay at his feet, head resting on Logan's right boot, ears folded down like he was listening to something only spirits forged in silence and devotion could understand. There was no command, no trained gesture, but in the rustling leaves and the K9's steady breath, Logan felt something return, an invisible thread he once thought lost. He bowed his head, eyes closing, hand still holding the capsule. "Atlas," he whispered, barely more than a breath. "I'm sorry I stayed silent so long." The words didn't echo. They didn't seek a reply. They just drifted upward through the tree limbs into the fading light, like smoke from a long, cold fire, long cold. His shoulders didn't tremble. His face showed no pain. Only one thing moved, a single tear, falling slowly onto the back of his hand. But this time it wasn't a tear of guilt, not of torment or trauma, not the kind that had choked him for 10 years like barbed wire around his heart. It was a tear of peace, clear, weightless, a quiet confirmation that the door had finally opened, and Atlas and Logan had stepped through. Muffin raised his head, met Logan's eyes, and gently touched his nose to the palm holding the capsule. One last time for the day. No urgency, no sentiment, just this: "I heard you." Then he lay back down, eyes closed, as if finishing a small ceremony of his own. Logan stroked the cloth. He didn't open it. He didn't need to. Every piece of bone, every grain of soil, every strand of fur inside no longer symbolized loss. They had become symbols of survival, of a love that never left. He didn't promise to stop hurting. He didn't have to. But he knew now, from this day forward, he would never carry it alone again. In the distance, church bells began to chime softly. They rang for no one in particular. But Logan knew, somewhere in that echo, one note belonged to Atlas. Not a call from beyond, but a voice from within. "I heard you, and I'm still here." The sun had settled fully to the west when Logan rose from the stone bench beneath the old oak tree, where, only minutes ago, he had whispered the truth he'd hidden for a decade. No more spotlights, no more silent crowds, just empty chairs and lengthening shadows across faded pavement, and Muffin, still following every step like a quiet breath come to life. Before climbing into the truck, Logan paused. He opened the passenger door, not ducking like before to stash the capsule in the shadow, not glancing around as if hiding something shameful. Instead, he opened the glove compartment, a small, unremarkable space where one might keep registration papers, a lighter, a pen. This time he placed the capsule inside, gently, squarely, not as part of a ritual, but as a father might place his son's keepsake in a bedside drawer, close, visible, and no longer secret. His hand lingered on the lid for a beat. Then he closed it softly. No sound, but the moment itself felt like a door finally closing on fear and opening on something else, acceptance and peace. He exhaled. His chest felt lighter, not because the burden had disappeared, but because it had finally been set in the right place, not weighing down his heart, but resting beside him, close enough to remember, far enough to live. Logan walked around to the driver's side. Muffin, a few steps away, remained still. The setting sun caught the deep brown in Muffin's coat, casting a soft, almost ethereal glow, like Atlas's eyes, reflected from a place beyond naming, glinting gently through this small body. No barking, no movement, just a look so calm, so deep, it seemed to pierce through the twilight itself. Logan turned, and for the first time that day he smiled. Effortless, genuine. No words, no commands. Just a nod to Muffin. A simple gesture, but within it, gratitude, recognition, and a quiet goodbye to a soul that had returned in another form. Muffin didn't move, but his tail gave a single, silent wag, as if to say, "I understand. I'm here." Logan entered the truck. The door closed softly, as if not to disturb something sacred. The old Ford F-150 rumbled to life. It rolled forward, steady and unhurried, leaving the hospital grounds behind. Like the man behind the wheel, no longer Logan, the one shackled by death's memory, but a new Logan who had learned to carry the past without letting it drown the present. In the rearview mirror, Muffin watched. Only after the truck disappeared behind the trees did Muffin finally turn and walk back toward John, who had waited the whole time, silent and steady, like a sentinel guarding a ceremony of rebirth that only hearts could understand. And from that afternoon on, when the capsule was no longer hidden beneath the seat, but placed gently in the glove compartment, Logan began a new kind of life. Not one where he forgot, but one where he learned how to share the unshareable. The following week, the PTSD therapy room at the VA hospital opened as usual, chairs arranged in a semicircle, sunlight casting shifting patterns across the tile floor. No one said anything when Logan walked in, but something in the air had changed. He no longer clutched a crumpled note or wore a long coat to hide shaking hands. Instead, he carried the capsule, now kept in a small wooden box, like a family heirloom, not for display, but for reverence. Muffin this time entered with John. No muzzle, no leash. He walked straight to Logan and lay down at his feet, right in that familiar spot, as if he knew he belonged there. Logan sat down. He didn't clear his throat, didn't scan the room. He simply placed the capsule in the center of the circle. Around him, each person had their reaction. A furrowed brow, a quiet closing of the eyes, a hand instinctively resting over the chest. The object was no longer mysterious or suspicious. It had become a visible vessel for a grief long buried. Then Logan began to speak. His voice was uneven, but unbroken. "Atlas," he said softly, like calling back an old friend, "was the first dog I ever worked with in the Army. He knew me before I knew myself." And the story unfolded, not as a battlefield report, but as fragments, training days, Atlas's stubborn moments, the look in his eyes during the firestorms, and his final act when he stepped in front of the IED. Logan didn't speak like a survivor. He spoke like someone finally bringing a friend home with words. The room was silent, like a chapel. Muffin remained still. But when Logan recounted Atlas's last moment, Muffin's ears dropped. An older vet, who had lost his son in Fallujah, gently reached out, his hand resting on the capsule, eyes welling with a kind of winter glass clarity. "Aye," the man said, voice catching after years of silence. "I still keep his last combat helmet, under my pillow. Never told anyone." Another voice spoke up, from the younger man sitting in the back, the one who once timidly asked Logan, "What was his name?" "My dad used to keep Lucky's collar," he said. "A black dog, broken ear. No one mentioned him at home because whenever they did, my mom cried. But today, I think I want to tell his story." Logan didn't respond. He just bowed his head. Muffin, sensing the shift, rose quietly and walked over to the young man, nudging his hand with his nose, then returned to the capsule, settling back down between the living and the memories they carried. From that day on, the capsule was no longer just Logan's. It sat on a wooden shelf in the therapy room, not as a showpiece, not as decoration, but as a place where someone could sit beside it and start with a name. A soldier, a dog, a scrap of cloth, an explosion, a sentence left unsaid, an apology, a promise, or simply a place to rest your hand when memory comes home. They called it the memory box. John didn't call it anything. He simply said, "That's Muffin's post." And Muffin, every time he walked into the room, always returned to that same spot, sitting beside it like a quiet gatekeeper. As if, beneath the layers of training, reaction, and command, he carried a higher mission that no one had to teach him. To guard what was lost, to share what no one dared to say, and to remind those still living that they are not alone. The soft morning sunlight drifted across the VA hospital parking lot like the first breath of day, casting a golden sheen over the silent rows of cars and the flags waving gently in the June breeze. No tension, no sharp eyes or urgent radio chatter. That morning carried a rare and precious rhythm, one that those who had known war, loss, and survival longed for more than anything else. John walked slowly beside Muffin, his back straight, eyes alert, but no longer burdened like in the early days. No emergency calls, no chief waiting on a report. Just a routine patrol, and a quiet ease between man and dog. Muffin, too, moved with calm, not the rigid readiness of duty, but a measured peace. Now and then, he turned to look up at John, his eyes warm, as if asking, "We're still on the right path, aren't we?" John reached down, gently stroking behind Muffin's ear. "You did good, old friend," he said. No dramatic tone, no swelling pride. Just enough for Muffin to hear, just enough to make the man's heart a little lighter. Muffin blinked, ears softly folded, and looked forward again, toward where the light spilled across the ground, opening the next stretch of road. And just then, from the distance, a familiar figure approached. Logan. He wore a simple t-shirt, sleeves rolled up to reveal an old scar now faded, not hidden anymore. In his hand, he held a leash, but not a chain, a guideline, the kind used when starting a journey with a new partner. Beside him walked a young dog, dark-coated and sleek. Its ears are not yet fully upright, but the look in its eyes made John stop mid-step, not because it resembled Atlas, but because in its gaze was a light beyond time, eyes that had once looked at Logan on night patrols, that had led through burning roads, that had lain beside shattered ground, and now once again looked forward, fearless. Logan smiled, small, but certain, like someone who'd stood in the middle of a firefight and held on to his soul. "He's the new guy," he said as he neared. "His name's Echo." John nodded, locking eyes with the pup's clear, open stare. "You training him?" "No," Logan answered, bending to stroke Echo's head. "I'm letting him train me." Muffin stepped toward Echo. No bark, no growl, just a quiet advance, head lowered, nose gently touching the young pup's forehead, a ritual-like motion, as if passing on something beyond words. "Go, little one. The road is long, but you won't walk it alone." Echo gave a small shiver, then sat beside Muffin, eyes wide and curious, but no longer afraid. 4 shadows, 2 men, 2 dogs, stood in the morning light. One who had lost, one who had witnessed, one who carries memory, one is just beginning. No more words were needed, just the light spreading across their steps, as if forming a bridge between past, present, and what was still taking shape. Because some things, like loyalty, sacrifice, and the quiet love between a man and his dog, never truly end. They only change form and keep walking on 4 steady feet. Some stories don't need an ending. They continue, quietly, in the hearts of those who still remember. Logan is no longer alone. The capsule is no longer a burden, and Muffin, like Atlas once did, still stands guard over the most sacred thing, the unbreakable bond between a human and a dog. And you, have you ever had a moment where a dog, somehow, understood the pain you couldn't say out loud? Share your story in the comments. If this touched something in you, give it a like, send it to someone who needs a quiet hand on the shoulder, and subscribe for more stories that don't shout. They simply walk beside you. Because sometimes, heroes don't wear armor. They just walk on 4 legs with eyes that know how to listen.